my work takes me to East St. Louis, where we're working on a choice neighborhood initiative, and I'm happy to go more into about what choice is. And I'm also one of the Shift Health Equity Advisors. So, Jessica, I'm sorry, I am going to read the script. So Jessica's based in LA. She works for a group called Nonprofit Finance Fund. And Jessica is the Chief Business Development Officer and oversees the special initiatives related to social impact investing and outcomes-oriented funding through collaborations. And the purpose of this session is for us to ground conversations in concepts and common language of outcomes funding, what this field encompasses, a little bit of history, and where we think the field is headed in the future. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Grace. Hi, everyone.
Good morning.
Great, good morning. So I don't know if this one is working, but I think this one is, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to use that. All right. Hi, it's nice to see some familiar faces. It's awesome to meet a lot of faces that aren't yet familiar, and I'm so thrilled to be a part of this conversation. So thank you, Jen, for inviting me, and everyone for facilitating this day. I'm Jessica LaBarbera, as Grace shared. I'm in Los Angeles with a group called Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I have to say this is a really interesting opportunity for me. I have been a part of the Pay for Success movement since it came to the U.S. shores, and I have been away from this space in the last few years, focused more broadly on the intersection of health and human services, and taking a lot of what was learned in Pay for Success. I come to this work with a history of about 15 years in community development. Most of my career has been in community development and social service delivery. And I come to this work having personally and organizationally done a lot of work recently on understanding the role that capital and capitalization and funding plays in perpetuating systemic inequities. I am part of a group, Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I'm realizing I'm advancing the wrong slides here, that is a community development finance institution. That means that we were founded from the Community Reinvestment Act, the financial arm of the last major legislative win in the 1960s civil rights movement, really to address redlining that was so nicely spelled out by Leslie earlier this morning. So we're coming to grapple and kind of reconcile and understand the history that we have as a responsibility to live up to the work that we have inherited. And I think for too long as a sector, we have applied colorblind principles to financial analysis and lending, right? We've sort of not considered the racial implications of not considering where dollars have flown and where capital has flowed in the sector. At the same time, NFF, as Rick pointed out so eloquently on my behalf earlier, I'm just going to echo what he said, NFF is an organization that not only has lent to the nonprofit sector, but has been an advisor to nonprofit organizations, a partner around strategic financial health. And how do you sustain organizations that are so critical in their communities to creating more just and vibrant societies and addressing some of these inequities that we've perpetuated for so long? And so many of you in the room have heard me stand on a spot like this before and talk about the chronic undercapitalization in the nonprofit sector. The fact that we, over and over again, underfund the organizations that we tasked with the most challenging social mandates to kind of improve the conditions in our communities. And I think there's a responsibility for us not just to think about the undercapitalization of the nonprofit sector, but the ways that organizations and communities led by people of color and communities of color have been doubly impacted by structural racism as well, right? So not only do we have a sectoral challenge, we have a racial issue as well. And so I'm going to bring some of that into the day-to-day, and I'm really excited by the opportunity to do so, and I thank you for the invitation to be a part of this day. I was asked to speak about the history of outcomes-based funding, which, where do you even begin, right? Native Americans thinking 7 generations in the future, the history of the church, you could start so many places. For the sake of time and brevity, I'm going to start 8 years ago, right? So think about where we were when the UK announced the first social impact fund in Petersburg, right? And thought about this idea of, at the time we called it social impact funds, we now call it Pay for Success. I'll get into a teeny bit of that. I do have the charts in here, but I'm not going to go through them for the sake of detail, right? I'm going to think about, why did we get into this space? What were the intentions, right? What were the originations? And going back to our groundings, despite the best of intentions, what have been some of the unintended impacts? And how do we think about improving Pay for Success 2.0 or Outcomes Funding 2.0. We have a depth of experience in this space, and by we I mean Nonprofit Finance Fund. We have facilitated a lot of the growth in education and exploration in this space. In 2009, we partnered with the White House Office of Social Innovation to host a series of educational trainings across the country, really introducing this concept in the US and exploring what it would look like here, as opposed to in the UK with a single party payer. We have created educational sessions. We've structured programs with the James Irvine Foundation here in California and the Social Innovation Funds nationally to channel millions of dollars towards the development and exploration of these projects across the state and across the country with partners in the room. And we have really focused, given who NFF is as an organization, on preparing community-based organizations to engage in new ways in outcomes-oriented partnerships. So I'll talk about this more, but really addressing the ways that the chronic undercapitalization of nonprofits has made it really difficult for them to engage from a seat of power in these conversations, and how critical that is to acknowledge and address as we move forward. We've invested into Pay for Success projects. We felt that it was important for us to really understand what does it look like from that side of the desk as well, and what are some of the challenges in tying payments to outcomes. And lastly, we've written about our experiences. And I apologize, I keep doing that. I need to make sure I'm moving the right slides here. So I want to take us back to 2010, right, and think about what motivated us to focus on outcomes funding. And this is an old slide. Went back in the Wayback Machine to see this. So 2010, we're in the midst of a great recession, right? There's a huge reductions in government shortfalls in spending, cuts to social services, at the same time that there's an increased demand for services. There's also a recognition that we're spending $2.6 trillion in social spending, but have very little by way of data or evaluation on the efficacy of the spending, right? Mixed results even of those, very few projects that are being evaluated. And there's a rise in viable impact measurement strategies, as well as an increasing interest in social impact investing, right? More and more people kind of wanting to have some sort of corporate responsibility or personal responsibility in terms of their investing. Okay, so we see all this sort of coming about and shifting our focus to talking about outcomes versus outputs, prevention versus treatment, and paying for what works. And so lo and behold, the UK rolls out the social impact bonds, and this is a blast from the past for many of us, and I'm not going to get again too into it, but I do want to talk about the structure to just reflect on what it was and what it wasn't. So at the heart of this structure, we had typically government prioritizing a problem, right? Sort of defining a bad status quo for people or families in their communities. There were service providers who were identified to pilot solutions to those problems, to expand or improve programs that they've been able to show achieved some positive results. And typically there was an intermediary engaged to help deliver that, because this is incredibly complex work, right? It still is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. These intermediaries would solicit and secure funding from foundations, impact investors, who would provide upfront capital to allow service providers to deliver services, right? And if those services delivered agreed upon milestones, if they kind of achieved targeted outcomes, then and only then, right, was the idea that the government would then repay those private investors. Now, don't worry if you miss 75%, that doesn't really matter, right? The point here being that there were all of these systems and institutions of power, thinking about how do we organize around outcomes, and hopefully the whole thing was leading to better outcomes for people and family, while also providing data around what was working. But we're not seeing a whole lot of leadership or engagement of the communities themselves in this model, right? Now, in time, just to kind of give some of the overview of the evolution of Pay for Success has been less directly or exclusively considered that model that I just walked us through way too quickly for folks who hadn't ever seen it before to appreciate, right? It is now, I think, more often considered a broad umbrella for the idea of paying for services tied to the delivery of outcomes, right? So tying payments to the delivery of outcomes. And there's a whole host of ways that that can be done, traditional performance-based contracting to thinking about ideas like rate cards or prize competitions. Not going to get into these details, not really the point of today. More to say that, when we think about the evolution of pay for success, I think even language can be a barrier, right? There's lots of different things that folks mean when they use the same words here. I do want to talk just a little bit about why, right? We talked about what was happening in the context in 2010. What were the aspirations of replicating pay for success in the United States? And I think there were really bold aspirations. Right? There was an acknowledgement that there were inherent flaws in the status quo and that there was a desire to change the system. So I mentioned before, the amount of public spending that the government puts into social programs, right? That $2.6 trillion dwarfs the amount of private and philanthropic investment annually, which is about $402 billion is what I have here in my notes, right? So there was a desire to change that largest lever of social spending. And to acknowledge that, when we really don't know what's happening as a result of that spending, that's maybe a problem, right? Maybe there's a desire that we have universally to have a better sense of, is that spending achieving the outcomes that we seek for it to create? There's also a recognition that the majority of social spending goes to remediation services as opposed to prevention services, right? And this is a reality of the fact that you kind of can't choose not to fund those services, right? And so preventative program tends to be funded when there's discretionary revenue available. But also, there's a need to shift to upstream health, as Melissa so eloquently described earlier. There was also an acknowledgement of the wrong pocket problem. This idea that, there's silo nature of funding and social issues don't neatly fall across funding agencies, right? They transverse lots of different arenas, as has been discussed this morning as well. There was also a very genuine and laudable, I'd say, desire to really identify and figure out what is working and do more of it, right? That's a premise that makes sense. I think where we get into trouble in this is defining how do you define what works, how do you measure those outcomes, and we'll talk more about that. There was also this desire to deepen partnerships across sectors, right? Think about more cross-sector collaboration, recognize that we can't solve intractable social issues if we don't work together. And a desire to engage not just private and corporate funders with more social investment interest, but also to shift the dynamics between community-based organizations and funders. Now, I will caveat that this may not have been everyone's primary motivation for this, but this is a large part of why NFF got so engaged in this space. Because for decades, we've been talking about the fact that, we disadvantage nonprofits in the communities they serve when we pay them just based on the inputs of what it takes to address social ills, right? So if you're gonna solve early child, if you're gonna get kids ready for preschool and you're just thinking about the inputs to those costs, you're not necessarily valuing the outputs or the outcomes of those early childhood programs being successful. And what a shift in thinking it would be, and perhaps a shift in funding it would be, if instead we focused on the value that was being created by community-based organizations. And gosh, what a great idea it would be if we involved them up front in the crafting of solutions to these issues as well. So for us, our engagement really came from a place of seeing potential to perhaps shift the conversations to more of a value focus. So what happened? We've launched over 25 projects in the last 8 years in the US, probably more depending on what you consider pay for success. There's been a scaling of preventative programs with evidence of efficacy, increased learning and evidence around a suite of preventative services. Namely, I'll call out supportive housing, home visiting, mental health, behavioral health services, some progress in early care. And there has absolutely been a shift in funding towards outcomes, right? When you look at the federal level, there's been policies and provisions put in place in recent years that direct over $1.7 billion annually to support multi-year outcomes in programs. So lots of good progress. Lots of jurisdictions that did not ultimately launch Pay for Success projects, but explored the concept and have taken learnings from that exploration and applied them. So a number of communities, including San Francisco, who explored Pay for Success and said, we aren't ready to do this. We don't have the data necessary for us to be able to engage in this way. And there have been some tremendous successes just from that exploration, which we'll talk more about later. I think most importantly, it's underscored that if we want to focus on outcomes, we need to think about better data. We need to think about evaluation and how we measure success. And there has been some really beautiful examples of really productive cross-sector partnerships, certainly with more room for improvement. So this is where I want to kind of spend the bulk of the time that we have left, is just in reflecting on where from the beginning of Pay for Success did we really not consider equity? And I'd say generally it was not, that was not, when Leslie pulled out the process tool, I would argue that there weren't a lot of those considerations. From the beginning, I think there's been a tension between this top-down and bottom-up approach, this desire to scale and this recognition that local context matters, right? It matters a lot. In the early days, I'd go so far as to say, there was this tool, this financing approach, and we proactively went looking for places and projects where it could be applied. That's the opposite of community-led. Let's just name that. Governments were driving priority issues, which is not in and of itself inappropriate, but I think there was often a reliance on, do we have the right types of data? Is this a program that is costing us enough money that even a marginal improvement would generate a savings? And even that focus on, is savings the right way to be prioritizing these projects, we can question that now too. This has come up a few times, but there are very few nonprofit providers who are ready to engage in this complex mechanism, and I'll talk more about this. But from the beginning, I think we sort of recognized this was really for the 1% of nonprofits, and some of this has evolved over time, absolutely. I'm being perhaps overly critical, but doing so intentionally. I think what was surprising, perhaps, was that this was also true for a number of governments, that the number of governments who had the right level and access to data was limited, and not exclusively, but oftentimes fell in consideration with the economic realities in those communities. I think something that we haven't named necessarily and is important to call out is that the complexity of this model, the multi-partner nature, forced a reliance on national experts, right? The structure was so complicated, it was really hard for local people to just kind of pick this up and put all of the pieces together. And let's also name, when we talk about structural inequities, that funding flowed largely to national intermediaries who were not necessarily of the communities that were being served, right? A lot of social and relational capital at play there as well. And then this idea of defining success around savings and measurable outcomes. The emphasis has shifted from that initial focus to cost savings to one that really much more predominates outcomes. I think in part there's equity considerations there. I think there's also a reality that cost savings just don't accrue that quickly that you can capture them, right? So I think, I don't want to be too generous in our recognition of why that evolution occurred. And there's this ongoing tension around measurable outcomes, right? How do you measure outcomes? How do you do that? And how do you do that in a way that doesn't discount those things that are harder to quantify? So just to spend a minute going into these things a little bit more briefly, a little bit more depth. When we think about scale versus local, I think NFF has come to a place where we feel that Pay for Success is an important tool for research and development, right? It is something that, while we appreciate the desire to scale and replicate at a national level, why wouldn't we want the best outcomes for everyone, right? The reality is that what's currently the best use of Pay for Success is to help us figure out what works here, what works in this community, right? And the projects aren't ends and means to themselves, right? They're a means to research and develop local solutions for local problems, to bring together community members to define and address critical needs, and to help governments partner and orient around outcomes. And I think what we've seen in the last 8 years is that projects that weren't initially launched as community-centric had to evolve in that way, right? And projects that were successful to get community-driven, engagement were ones that really went local. So I'll just name, Nurse Family Partnership in South Carolina struggled to get the enrollment they needed in their program. And ultimately, what they did was they ultimately sent folks to go into nail salons and hairdressers, like places where mothers were, and said, hey, if you have pregnant moms come in, tell them about the availability of these services, right? So understanding where the women in their communities were going and where they could access them was much more effective than some sort of anonymous state-level process for enrollment. And I think that this reality can sometimes be squarely at odds with the desire to scale. And I think that's a tension and a polarity that we might, choose to explore as the day goes on today. The next thing I'll drill down is this idea of, who's at the table matters, and shifting power structures is critical at this point. We need more providers, and even more than providers, recipients at the table, right? And we need them there early, we need them there often. I think Pay for Success at its best amplifies the voices of providers and showcases their abilities as creative problem solvers, right? They are oftentimes the folks who are closest to the ground, closest to the problem, and closest to solutions. And not to engage them early, we're missing something there. Same goes for recipients of services. I think, again, just highlighting the evolution in this space, I think about the Alameda project, so a project just nearby here, that focused on recidivism reduction through behavioral health supports and engagement of community health navigators, people with lived experience, people with the same cultural backgrounds and language backgrounds as the individuals that they were being served, having a very strong established relationship with the district attorney and recognizing that there was an ability for them to expand their services to broader populations, and how that orientation, that sort of focus on the community relation and the knowledge of the local community has been so important in designing an impactful program there. Just for the sake of saying it out loud, because I think it's important, I think there is more that needs to be done to pass the mic, right? To listen to and define and to fund those organizations that are most capable of defining and developing culturally competent solutions. So just quickly, this idea of defining success. There has been, as I mentioned, this evolution away from an initial focus on cost savings. And yet, I think oftentimes Pay for Success headlines still focus on whether or not investors got repaid. Right? And that's not to say it's not insignificant, it's certainly a consideration. But we tend not to consider the lasting social progress that can be made just from exploring these tenets. So I named San Francisco a minute ago. I mean, this is a place where the exploration of Pay for Success as a strategy around homelessness was deemed no way could we use this approach. But it did lead to the Office of Homelessness. It did lead to the recognition that if we're going to do something about homelessness, we need to not do it on a departmental by departmental level, right? It also led them to engage Pay for Success principles in a project called the Phoenix Project with Hope SF. So working within the redevelopment of public housing, specifically to expand economic opportunity for young people. They involved the young people who would be in this age bracket in these programs, in the design of the program and the evaluation, right? So there's ways that just thinking about this multifaceted cross-sector approach can have positive benefit, and we need to think about meeting people where they are, meeting communities where they are. Not saying success is just, you have all of these pieces in place, you can do all of the measurement, that's success, but recognizing that when we look into see governments and communities that don't yet have those abilities to measure quantitatively, and we meet them where they are and we make investments in that, that's progress. And so I think that's the last piece that I'll just touch on today, is that there's a need for us to acknowledge that systems change is long-term and expensive work, right? And this widespread underinvestment in the social sector and in communities of color specifically has to be addressed if ultimately we're going to get to scale and impact around outcomes measurement, right, and outcomes funding. Pay for Success is absolutely not a magic fix. I think we all know that. It's challenging, it's expensive work in and of itself. That's a barrier to entry. And yet it has encouraged conversations about the ways that money flows that's often inefficient and unfair. And addressing that widespread and historic underinvestment in the organizations we trust to solve our biggest social problems, I think is long past due. Right, so we can talk about the policy changes that are necessary, but we also need to think about the funding, the way that dollars flow. And as our investment in the capacity of local communities to become their own experts and problem solvers, I think that's another piece that we really have not addressed adequately yet. So again, Pay for Success not being a panacea, but when I reflect on this work, I keep coming back to a place of considering how a desire to measure outcomes intersects with the historic underinvestment in the sector. And I question how much progress we can make on outcomes without addressing these underinvestments. And so I do look at Pay for Success and I think about the fact that while it's not perfect, it's gained traction, a lot more than a lot of other collective impact efforts. And so I want to just think about that, right? It was certainly challenged by its complexity, its lack of efficiencies, right? Even after you did it more, oftentimes we couldn't replicate it less expensively. And I know there are folks in the room that are working on that still, so I don't want to discredit the efforts and the progress that folks have made. There are really big and bold aspirations that we mentioned up front, and sort of, frankly, short attention spans. I think, not living up to those being the panacea challenged it as well, right? There's just this desire to get to big wins and scales really quickly, and a lack of stick-to-itiveness, if you will, right? To recognize that because we've underinvested in so many places, we need to first correct for that before we can even begin to think about scale. Now, my opinion, not even an NFF opinion there. I do think there's something to call out about the fact that scrutiny can speed change. The high visibility, high stakes nature of a lot of these contracts did lead to expedited improvements, right? So there's something there that we might want to consider going forward. Something about not taking the public attention and spotlight off of these efforts. And I also think it's important that we call out the critical role that the Social Innovation Fund played in really bolstering this space. It provided critical funding for the development of these projects, as well as fertile ground for knowledge sharing. And that's something that's just so often missing, right? We don't have that funding, and not enough of it. And since the Social Innovation Fund has gone away, there really has not been something else or someone else who stepped into that space. And so there's some opportunities now to think about, what do we do with national efforts like CIPRA, the Social Impact Partnership to Pay for Results Act, right? Which does actually put some federal funding towards paying for outcomes. How do we think about efforts by folks like American Forward to garner bipartisan support for Pay for Success? If we are able to, sort of use those things most effectively, what do we use them for? And so I'll leave it with this, and I apologize, I'm tying a lot of evolving thoughts into this, and it's not a particularly practiced presentation yet, but I do think that when we think about integrating large-scale change, while at the same time recognizing the centrality and the critical nature of centering community ownership, we have to recognize that this is long-term work and that it takes upfront investment. I think that there's an obligation that we have to think about how we build critical capacities among organizations and communities that have been most disconnected from financial resources, and recognize that that in and of itself takes time and upfront investment, but really has the most potential for long-term results. And that's not just about supporting organizations and communities, it's also about investing in new models for social investment systems. So I'm really excited to be with you all here today and to think about how do we do that? How do we think about a Pay for Success 2.0 that considers all of these equity considerations that weren't named up front? And I'd love to hear from folks, what did I miss? What else? So, thank you.
Jessica, thank you. And if you want to just stay here for just a quick second. And Jonathan, I'll look at you, and Michael, and all of us just kind of thinking a little bit on the fly with what we want to try and do between months. Because I suspect folks are excited to think about how to start engaging with some of the background that we've had. Is that right? Yeah, please, I'm on stage, I'm ready. And so, Jonathan, as you coming up next, starting to think about vision, and I'm sorry, I just do this in front of everybody, we just talk transparently about adjusting agendas. Do you feel like you're ready to kind of help people get into and engage around this, around kind of vision and get into conversations? Yeah? And then, Michael, if we do that right before lunch and then polarities after, is that cool? Is that cool with everyone else? Does that sound all right? Awesome. Thank you for letting us flex on it. And Jessica, I also I put on the charts questions for Leslie and Melissa and questions and thoughts for Jessica. Just I anticipate that folks are going to want to go deep. So those are some spots that please find. So thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so Eugene, can I invite you up to introduce Jonathan and welcome Jonathan? And then Jonathan will